Our adversary doesn't see the United States infrastructure environment as a Department of Defense, as a global economy, as a Department of Transportation. They see one connected battle space with a great number of seams. Port is really the textbook example. Approximately 80% of cranes that we use at U.S. ports are purchased from Chinese companies.
Welcome to Cyber Focus from the Medairy Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and this week we have a special episode with two guests to go over a report we recently did jointly with Booz Allen and Hamilton, and it is on Anchored in Zero Trust, looking at the role that our ports and port security, the significance, and how we can translate some of the nouns into the verbs. Today we have Brad Medairy, who is an executive vice president and leads all of Booz's cyber efforts. Dare I say, he's also a senior fellow at the Medairy Institute and co-leading an effort we're doing on all things China. Joining Brad, we also have Dave Forbes, who is a whirling dervish getting a lot of the work done in the paper itself, doing some amazing work, and he runs the physical and cyber practice at Booz. Brad, thanks for joining us. Dave, thanks for joining us. So I thought we'd start with putting the paper into context. And this isn't just coming up with an idea of a vulnerability. We have endless vulnerabilities, but this is something that's imminent, it's here, it's now, and there's a bad actor who's driving some of this. So dare I say, the People's Republic of China. But Brad, maybe to help us put it into context, the typhoons, and why did we zero in on the zero trust issue?
So putting the paper in context of China and the cyber activity, I think it's important that we kind of look at some of the key wave tops over the past few years. So as we look at the Chinese cyber activity and the cyber threat, I think a few things. One, I think it's marked by growing sophistication. We've seen an accelerated evolution of their TTPs. CISA released a great report around their living off the land TTPs. And so the Chinese are growing in sophistication. So I think one is, we've seen them continue to accelerate their tradecraft and making them harder to detect. Second, I would say it's escalation. And as we saw with the typhoons, we saw the Chinese going after the defense industrial base. And we've seen that for years in terms of IP theft. We saw with Volt Typhoon attacking or going after the telecommunication infrastructure. And probably the most alarming is what we've seen in terms of the attacks against the pre-staging of capabilities against the U.S. critical infrastructure, Volt Typhoon. And from my perspective, Volt Typhoon is probably the most significant because there's no real intelligence value in terms of what they were doing. They were pre-staging capabilities in the U.S. critical infrastructure, and the only real explanation is to achieve some sort of potential future kinetic effect.
And that's line one in our report is they're already inside U.S. infrastructure. So and I think Volt Typhoon was a great example and a wake-up call, because to your point, we've seen intelligence preparation in the battlefield for many years, but this is living off the land in the system. So this isn't a tomorrow issue. This is a here and now issue.
Yeah, 100%. The adversary, they're behind the walls. Mm-hmm. And, we talk a lot about advanced persistent threats, and we tend to focus on the advanced and the threat piece, right? Mm-hmm. We talked about living off the land. That goes to the advanced techniques, the threat in terms of the impact that they can pose on the infrastructure. But I think the key thing in my mind is the P, which is persistence. And this adversary is persistent, meaning that we're in a forever war mm-hmm. in cyberspace. Mm-hmm. The adversary is going to continue to look to embed themselves in our infrastructure. They're going to continue to evolve their capabilities, right? It's not like we figured out Volt Typhoon. We've been able to remediate it in certain cases, and then they're just going to go away. That was just step one. They're going to this is going to be forever. And so I think that we just need to prepare for the long haul here, and we need to continue to up armor our cyber defense infrastructure and our cyber defense posture. And it's going to be a game of cat and mouse for years to come.
Awesome. And Dave, to pull you into the discussion, there have been some reports on ZPMC and other concerns with our cranes, surface-to-shore cranes, but why ports?
So we went right into this discussion talking about protecting critical infrastructure, right? And ports are critical infrastructure. When we talk about the threat landscape, the cyber threat landscape at Booz Allen, we talk about one connected battle space. And that's a really important context, I think, to bring up early on in this discussion. One connected battle space means that our adversary, doesn't see the United States infrastructure environment as a Department of Defense, as a global economy, as a Department of Transportation. They see one connected battle space with a great number of seams, right? Seams that they want to exploit. And when I look at the port environment, port is really the textbook example of one connected battle space. Ports as critical infrastructure. They represent how we move material, how we move equipment. It's the nexus of the economy and national security. In some, scenarios, it's ports are key factors in how we move national security equipment and personnel, right? So approximately 80% of cranes that we use at U.S. ports, right, material handling equipment, are purchased from Chinese companies. So when you bring together this idea of protecting critical infrastructure in a Volt Typhoon environment, right? Furthermore, in an increasingly connected world where platforms and infrastructure are now talking to each other, you've got a bigger problem on your hands that needs to be looked at closely.
Absolutely. And I love how you painted it in the Volt type, because sometimes we look at these issues as disconnected. And I also love the fact that I like to say our government tends to look at the world through its own boxes and org charts, its own authorities, understandably to one extent or another, but that's not the case with our adversaries. And just to put a fine point on it, we're saying it has the potential to impede the ability to project power, deploy forces, move material, move people, and not only on the defense side, but economically. How significant are U.S. ports to our economy?
Well, over $2.1 trillion of our economy on an annual basis is dependent on port throughput, right? The United States intermodal transportation, $1 trillion.
Just let that sink in.
The United States intermodal transportation system is on a daily basis at the center of throughput of goods and services to the United States. So let me also when we're talking about critical infrastructure cybersecurity, we sit here and we talk about and prepare for responding to potentially devastating attacks. But it doesn't need to be a devastating attack. It needs to be a disruption. It needs to be a distraction. It needs to be something that we're worried about. So 80% of cranes that we use on a daily basis at every port, you take the port of Long Beach, right, the largest port on the West Coast, it doesn't take a lot to make you worry about throwing things off balance on our economy and national security posture.
And then if we just look back to COVID, how significant that was from a supply chain. But Brad, jump in.
Yeah, well, let me comment on COVID. If you think about back in the COVID days, Frank, you and I were talking about just the impact it had on us personally. And, I remember, during COVID, we were all stuck at home. I wanted to buy a bike, and I went to the shop, and they're like, well, you can get a bike in probably 12 to 18 months because it's floating on a ship, and we're not sure when it can actually get into port. And so cyber effects can certainly have economic and affect us as a society. But one of the points I wanted to bring up was really the impact of ports on national security. And I think one of the phrases that I've heard that I love, cybersecurity is national security. And one of the reasons that this paper we vectored in on ports is because ports are really so strategic to us in terms of our military readiness and national security. The Department of Defense, they identified 22 strategic ports, as as essential to operations, and 17 of those are commercial ports. And as Dave talked about, those commercial ports are using OT equipment. Some of it is running Chinese software, and it's vulnerable. And impact on a major cyber event, as we've seen in Singapore, as we've seen in Seattle, where there was a ransomware attack that certainly disrupted port operations. Those ports get disrupted in wartime. It's going to impact our ability to fight and impact our military readiness.
Which is everything. I mean, there's the old adage, amateurs talk strategy, professionals logistics. But at the end of the day, ports are at the hub of all logistics.
Definitely,
right?
definitely.
I mean, if you can't move people, food, equipment, game over.
Yep.
And looking at the risk landscape, ransomware is obviously not only a port concern, it's literally democratized cyber risk. But anything unique to the ports in addition to cranes that?
Well, I think that to that point, the ports are a center of a whole string of other infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's the equipment, the transportation system, and the goods that come into the port
Mm-hmm.
that get uploaded onto maritime vessels, and then at the other end, it's the throughput and output on the other port.
Mm-hmm.
So the supply chain is represented at the port. And it's also important to know that we've identified the maritime port as a use case. Mm-hmm. Right? It's one use case in our transportation system, in our supply chain that we're examining. But these problems around protecting critical infrastructure in this environment, they run into other parts of the supply chain.
Really good point. Now, I want to pull that thread in two different ways, both from a zero trust perspective, but first from an OT perspective. And you can't escape our podcast without a brief discussion around operational technology, but shed some light on that, Brett.
Yeah, let's talk. I mean, let's think about the cybersecurity journey that we've been on for the last 20 years. It really started with us getting control of the enterprise,
mm-hmm.
and in the enterprise cybersecurity, we really focused on understanding the environment and be able to bound the cybersecurity risk. Now that got complicated as the attack surface continued to expand. We saw cloud, mobile, SaaS, and now everything is connected, through 5G and other types of comms, right? So we spent years trying to bound the enterprise environment. It's gotten more difficult with the growing attack surface, but really we haven't spent as much time focused on the OT environment. And I would say probably over the last 7 to 8 years, we've really started the conversation around OT. And frankly, it's just different than the enterprise IT environment. Mm-hmm. Let's take like a manufacturing facility. A manufacturing facility, you generally capitalize that over a 20-year period. Mm-hmm. And so, I was thinking back in preparation for this conversation, some work I've done in the pharmaceutical space. And, I had the opportunity to go visit and work on the shop floor. And we started looking at the attack surface there. And as we looked at the environment, there was not only controllers, but there was devices there that had operating systems dating back to the 90s,
mm-hmm.
Windows NT, Windows 95. And so I would say these OT environments are super complex. I would say that it's kind of become the Smithsonian of IT, meaning you have a little bit of everything in the environment. They tend to be capitalized over a very long period, meaning that you're not going to do major tech refreshes until you actually fully realize, the life cycle of that particular facility.
And sometimes that's not even possible, right?
Right,
I mean,
right.
If you think of the old challenges we had with industrial control systems,
yeah.
To take them offline could actually cause consequences.
In OT, the uptime is paramount.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. The OT systems are up. It means it drives revenue, it drives dollars, and any time an OT system is not functioning, it affects the bottom line of that organization.
So I think the reality is, we're still trying to get our arms around the OT environment, and there's step one was bridging the gap between the operational community and the
mm-hmm.
technology and the IT community. We've been on that journey for a period
while.
of time. We've started to harden the environments, but the reality is these environments are plagued by a tremendous amount of tech debt. And it's a real challenge in terms of, how do you address this problem when you have so much tech debt across so much of our critical infrastructure?
Unrelated to our report, but significant in the way to think about sort of that IT, OT convergence and physical cyber convergence. With new infrastructure spends, that's the time when you can get this right, isn't it? Because, you've got legacy systems that are up and running. Now they're netted by Internet of Things devices, which brings about a whole new attack surface. But the time to make the biggest difference is when you have a new spend, I think.
Yeah, 100%.
And I've been an advocate. You guys can disagree with this. I think in a perfect case on any IT spend, about 12 to 14% of that should include security. Then if you unpack that a little further between IT, OT is still the Rodney Dangerfield of the community there. How do we bump that up?
Yeah, one of the things,
and disagree with the premise.
I think it's certainly much. It costs less baking in security,
and it saves way money over the life cycle. Right. So,
there's whether you call it baking in security, whether you call it secure by design, the reality is anything that you can do, before you actually get that system in production is going to buy down cost, and it's going to increase the cybersecurity posture.
Anything to add on that before we jump into zero trust?
I'm always very happy when Brad brings up the tech debt issue, and just adding a little bit more on this. OT needs to be baked into new construction and new build, right? We've established that. But in parallel to that, we are going to be dealing with legacy infrastructure and legacy OT for years to come. We have solutions now that are achievable and more affordable and accessible to asset owners. So one of the key takeaways needs to be, we got a budget for baking in OT, but in parallel to that, let's move quickly to access what's available now to protect those legacy systems that are working side by side with those new build.
Any other thoughts on what some of those solutions are? I do want to get to the zero trust.
It's a great segue into talking about zero trust.
There you go.
Right? There are three things that in the OT space we need to be doing. Number one, we need to have asset visibility. You can't protect what you can't see. Number two, it's imperative that we begin to integrate advanced technology solutions, advanced control solutions. And number three, along the way, we need to do OT modernization. And inevitably, there are things that need to be replaced. Okay, so zero trust comes in because it's one of those advanced technologies that we can chat about here now. But those are the three things that need to be done.
Brad, anything to add on the zero trust? And how do we take the bumper sticker and buzzword and make it real?
Yeah, I think what Dave said in terms of number one, know your environment.
You got to do that.
And it sounds pretty basic and pretty fundamental, but I would say pretty consistently when we go into an OT environment, one of the things that we see quite often, and we actually highlighted that in the report. The report talked about a communication device in the crane system that allowed for remote communications, and that's actually pretty standard in what we see in a lot of environments. And one of the reasons is vendors want the ability to be able to remote in, to be able to maintain, upgrade, and diagnose issues with their systems. And they will put sort of communication backdoors into those environments. And in a lot of cases, the environment owners aren't tracking that at all. I was thinking back on a client engagement, and we were sitting in McLean, Virginia, and we were working with a European company, and we were talking to them about their environment. And they said, look, we're not too concerned about our OT environment because we've implemented segmentation, there's no access, and we've kind of created this big castle wall around the environment. And we're like, well, we appreciate that. However, right now we're actually able to VPN directly in to your OT environment because here is a comms link that wasn't secured, and so we help them sort of diagnose that. But the reality is step one is really kind of understand the battle space, understand your environment, so you know what you have to defend.
Absolutely. And this goes all the way back to Sun Tzu's principles, to know yourself, know your enemy. And I feel like we learn that lesson the hard way all too often. So taking that zero trust set of issues, we were very deliberate in looking at ports, but this cuts across all critical infrastructure, including those that are purely economic. But I have a hard time differentiating some of those too, because I think it blends with the national security issues. And honestly, economic security is national security. But what are some other sectors? What are we doing next, Dave?
Well, so going into the work that we've done with McCrary on this report, our baseline understanding was the work that we have done and are doing at DoD installations. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this discussion around zero trust at ports and zero trust for critical infrastructure stems from our work protecting critical infrastructure and OT across DoD installations, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. So, Brad touched on knowing your environment and knowing the OT systems that you're working with. Mm-hmm. Okay, so where do we go from here? The audience needs to understand that if you are protecting OT and you have asset visibility and you're employing solutions out there that provide continuous monitoring on your OT networks, you've already started your zero trust journey. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So now we're in DoD. We're here focused on the paper that emphasizes zero trust at ports. It's all of the critical infrastructure sectors, Frank. Mm-hmm. And it's also going back to other DoD and service installations. It's marrying up zero trust protection of OT for the strategic goals that we have for national security.
And in addition to lighting up your own system and knowing where because I agree with that. It's pretty hard to do it if you don't even understand where you fit in. But resilience is a key part of this, right? Because I think it's fair to say, even if you are implementing as robust of a zero trust process, you can't protect everything everywhere all the time from a thinking enemy. The perpetrator bases their actions on our actions. So in a way, you batten down risk, and that's the best we can do. But that's not game over, right?
I think when you talk about resiliency, in general, OT environments are usually designed to be fairly resilient. Mm-hmm.
Because they were built with 3 Mile Isle prevention types of things.
They were built to to fail over. They were built to assume that there were going to be issues, and then how do you be resilient and fail over in those environments? But I don't think that they were, when they were designed, they thought about an advanced cyber actor behind the walls. Mm-hmm. And as we talk about zero trust, I think the whole premise of zero trust is that you assume breach. And what that means is, in your environment, from a cybersecurity perspective, you have minimal trust and continuous verification. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, our advice to operators is when we talk to folks about the cybersecurity world, the cybersecurity professionals tend to be fear mongers. And so they walk into an environment and they paint this awful picture. And, in many cases, folks are like, thank you. I don't know what to do now. and so, I think that, working through, okay, let's assume, an adversary is on my network. How are they going to move? How are they going to operate? What are they going to do? And that gives you the ability, because the problem with zero trust is it's this big ambiguous term, right? Mm-hmm. And, in the cybersecurity landscape, I often talk about, hey, there's 8,000 cybersecurity product vendors, there's 20 billion in annual investment, and of those 8,000 companies, 4,000 of them are AI and 4,000 of them are zero trust, right? Mm-hmm. And so, everyone is just looking for this silver bullet in terms of how to protect their environment. And the reality is, there is no silver bullet. You need to really assess your environment. You need to understand your unique characteristics, your unique threat posture, and your unique challenges, and then you need to tailor the particular solution around that. But it all starts with the recognition that, hey, someone could be in my environment. Now, how do I need to think about that?
You want to build on that?
Yeah, let me build on that, because it's a great foundation for what zero trust is and it is not. And I'll tell you what, zero trust is a framework for actionable solutions. Mm-hmm. We've gotten really good at doing assessments in OT over the last several years. Okay, assessments need to be faster. They need to be focused on the priority infrastructure. You can't protect and you can't afford to protect everything the same way. But zero trust is the implementation of technical solutions that you are in an assumed breach environment. So it's testing out the use cases, and they look different. You got OT, SDN, you got different types of network cloaking, but it is an actionable implementation of technical solutions to protect the network, going well beyond just assessing what your vulnerabilities are.
And not to go too off piece, but there's also an active cyber defense set of questions here too, right? Where we can be proactive defensively. And what are some of those technologies? Either of you have a good, and obviously we've had other people discussing some of those, but any good anecdotal examples of where zero trust has made a big difference?
Well, I think that zero trust has forced the conversation about innovation in OT in particular. Let me give you an example. We are now testing solutions that bring AI into the OT environment. We are looking at machine-to-machine identity capabilities that go beyond the traditional network visibility. We have tremendous vendor technologies and partners that are out there now that do asset visibility. But we are seeing AI, machine-to-machine identity detection capabilities that we haven't seen before. And I really think that this move towards zero trust, frankly, the mandate for zero trust on OT networks has forced the discussion about faster innovation in the space.
Anything to add there?
Yeah, I also think that when you think about like the outcomes you want from zero trust, right? Why are you doing this? And I think two things. One, you want to be more effective, meaning that you want to have a better security posture for your network. The second piece is you want to be more efficient, meaning that you want to be able to buy down some of your tech debt. And the reality is, I think you can actually drive down a lot of license cost in your environment. I think that when we go into our client spaces, we tend to see a lot of tools and technologies, but there's a lot of ways to be able to kind of consolidate and be much more efficient there. And so, I think about some of the work that we're doing across the Department of Defense on a program called Thunderdome. And Thunderdome is really at the intersection of infrastructure modernization and cybersecurity. And we're working to roll that out across the broader Department of Defense. And it's increasing the collective security posture. And it's actually a lot more efficient because we're doing it at scale and we're able to retire a lot of tech debt out of the environment.
And I love, and this should be obvious, but it's not always so obvious, but having an outcome-based perspective in mind is probably, you would think that everyone would do it, but not everyone does, right? So I want to put us in the shoes or sandals or whatever of a port security owner operator. What are the two things? And when you look at sort of surface to shore cranes, that's a bigger issue. That's a manufacturing issue. There are not many U.S. cranes, if any. We have other countries we can turn to, Japan and others who are investing in that space. But what would be the three things you would tell the head of a port right now? Los Angeles, Long Beach.
I would say that number one, have systems in place to have visibility on the data going to and from your material handling equipment on ports. Number two, prioritizing those systems and processes. Which ones on the port, which MHE, which cranes are non-negotiably needing to be ready and capable and undeterred. And then number three, what technologies and what are you using, what's in place to track that data and alert you if there's an anomaly that has taken place that's going to prevent you from conducting and continuing those port operations.
Any additional points you'd bring up here, Brad?
Dave, mine are probably a little more basic, but if I'm running in a port, probably the last thing I'm thinking about is cybersecurity. Other than
when it's too late,
right?
Yeah.
Other than ransomware attacks that happened a couple years ago in Singapore and in Seattle, most operators aren't thinking about cybersecurity on a daily basis. And so, one, I think I would suggest, run a tabletop exercise to really understand the threat and the risk. And then the second is really understand. Once you understand that threat, understand your environment. What IT, what OT assets do you have across your environment, and what is the risk posture associated with that? And I think it starts with just the basics.
And I would even say, not theoretical, just take the Typhoons and use them as the use cases within that tabletop. Because the impact, consequence, and intent is very different from a Volt Typhoon, which is living off the land. And as we discussed, it's taking intelligence preparation in the battlefield to a whole nother dimension versus espionage. But they all matter.
Yeah. A lot of the operators that I talk to, cyber is abstract, and it can never, it can never happen to me mentality until it does.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really think that awareness and understanding of both the threat and the environment, the faster that we can get there, then we can actually get to more informed conversations around, okay, how do we buy down that risk?
Absolutely. On the tech stack, I want to hear a little.
Well,
more
and part of that speed to the faster that we can get there is having a not just willingness, but easy processes in place to prototype solutions at ports. Brad mentions Thunderdome. One of the things we're enabled to do on that program is to do pilots for zero trust for OT networks, and to go into DoD spaces, and test out solutions based on asset owners' priorities. It is about what's most important to you and how you keep the mission going at a port, and making it easier for port operators and port owners to test out different solutions. And in many ways, one of the things we've realized around zero trust for OT is you identify a relatively safe environment where you can test out OT solutions. Absolutely. And see what the outcomes are. And then you scale the ones that you think that work best for your environment.
We're coming near the end of our time. Any questions I didn't ask that I should have?
Frank, I would just offer that for asset owners on ports and across the federal space in particular, these zero trust solutions are accessible. We need to be more creative and more willing to collaborate and just try stuff in the field. We can't rely upon the status quo. We can't rely upon just assessing and understanding our vulnerabilities. We got too much good technology and innovation out there not to try it.
Awesome. Brad, you've got the final word and call to action.
You ask any questions you didn't ask. I would say, what's next? As we look over the horizon, we started by talking about we're in a period of, escalation in cyberspace. And so I would say in terms of what's next is it's going to be continued escalation, but I think things are going to start moving faster. And, with AI, AI is going to be used by advanced adversaries to accelerate cyber capabilities and cyber effects. And so I think that we're going to see we're in a period of, things escalating at a much faster pace than we've ever seen. We've got to be prepared.
Adversarial AI is at the top of the list. Yeah.
I think that we're there. And I think that we're going to continue to see things happen that blow our minds.
Any final thoughts around undersea that we need to be thinking about here?
I think that
because the ports is the water's edge. There's more that goes to the ports.
I think anything in the digital world is at risk.
Awesome.
Yeah. We're finding the conversation around OT and the cyber physical domain and the cyber physical aspect of warfare and defense spans surface, subsurface, aviation, space.
And I feel like we still treat those in isolation. Someone's got to bring it all together to get that true rich picture. Sea, undersea, land, space, cyber.
And
is that Booz?
Well, I think that we play a key part in that. And you ask for kind of like the call to arms. And maybe the final thought is, Dave talked about a term that we use called one battle space. And so when we talk about one battle space, we mean that our adversaries don't look at our nation in isolation. They don't look at it as the utility sector, ports, the US federal government, hospitals, manufacturing. They look at our nation as one holistic battle space. And when they're preparing to impose cyber effects against us, they're looking at it holistically. So if we flip that from a one battle space perspective in terms of call to arms, is I'm not sure any of us can solve this problem alone, but together we're stronger. And I think forums like this, where we can actually have a conversation, where we can educate each other, where we can partner together, collectively, we're much stronger. And I think that's the call to arms, right? It's going to take all of us, and it's going to take sharing information, collaborating around solutions, understanding the adversary at speed, so that
failing fast, so you can get better too, right?
So we can continue. We can continue to get better.
Gentlemen, thank you. Very insightful, very thoughtful, and onward and upward. Thank you.
Frank.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cyber Focus. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. Your ratings and reviews help us reach more listeners. Drop us a line if you have any ideas in terms of topics, themes, or individuals you'd like for us to host. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.